Hello, book readers. Welcome back to another episode of Storyteller, because Teller was taken O2. Okay. Well, tonight I'm going to be reading. I'm not going to be reading from this. J.G. Ballinger. You know I'd like to, but no one's been giving any money to my Patreon page, so I would have been reading Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut. But so the very first line as well. It was almost 3 o'clock when Mary Jane finally found Eloise's house. Okay. So that's a teaser for what could be going on if anyone pledges to my Patreon page. But as no one has done so yet, I will be reading from this. This is a collection of short stories by J.D. Sallard. Okay. And you may be thinking, well, I like J.D. Sallard. So if that's the case, then you'll enjoy this book reading. Find which one I'm going to read. Let's have a look. The Air Disaster. Page 342. I already had it marked in with my bookmark. Okay, so yeah, I'll be reading from J.D. Sallard, Complete Short Stories, Volume 2. The Air Disaster. Yep. Okay. But first, with Ballinger, I would have been drinking ale, but with Sallard, wine. Okay. Let's put this back right. Oh wait, let's fill this back with really hot water because I didn't want it to get cold while I was going through the story. It's too hot. I'm going to have to put some hot water in here, so yeah, I can't cook this. It's far too hot. Hi again, book readers. So, cool water a little. Hopefully it won't get too cold before I'm done reading. So, in case you missed earlier, J.D. Sallard, The Air Disaster. Okay. This is my audience. Only he pays on Patreon. Okay. The news that the world's largest airliner had crashed into the sea near Acapulco with 1,000 passengers on board reached me while I was attending the annual film festival of a resort. When the first radio reports were relayed over the conference loudspeakers, I and my fellow journalists abandoned our seats in the auditorium and hurried out into the street. Together, we stared silently at the sunlit ocean, almost expecting to see an immense cascade of water rising from the distant waves. Some really cheap red wine, because no one's giving money to my Patreon page. Like everyone else,
I realized that this was the greatest disaster in the history of world aviation, and a tragedy equal to the annihilation of a substantial town. I had lost all interest in the film festival, and was glad when the manager of my television station in Mexico City ordered me to drive to the scene of the accident some 30 miles to the south. As I set off in my car, I remembered when these huge airliners had come into service. Although they represented no significant advance in aviation technology, in effect they were double-decker versions of an earlier airliner. There was something about the figure 1000 that touched your imagination, setting off all kinds of forebodings, and no amount of... Start that again, that's a long sentence. Okay. Although they represented no significant advance in aviation technology, in effect they were double-decker versions of an earlier airliner. There was something about the figure 1000 that touched your imagination, setting off all kinds of forebodings that no amount of advertising could dispel. 1,000 passengers. I mentally counted them off. Businessmen, elderly nuns, children returning to their parents, eloping lovers, diplomats, even a would-be hijacker. It was this almost perfect cross-section of humanity, like the census sample of an opinion pollster, that brought the disaster home. I found myself glancing compulsively at the sea, expecting to see the first handbags and life jackets washed ashore on the empty beaches. Pardon me. Okay. The sooner I could photograph a piece of floating debris and return to Acapulco, even to the triviality of the film festival, the happier I would feel. Unfortunately, the road was jammed with southbound traffic. Clearly, every other journalist, both foreign and Mexican, present at the festival, had been ordered to the scene of the disaster. Television camera vans, police vehicles, and the cars of over-eager sightseers were seen bumper to bumper. Annoyed by their ghoulish interest in the tragedy, I found myself hoping that there would be no trace of the aircraft when you arrived and stepped onto the beach. In fact, as I listened to the radio bulletins, there was almost no information about the crash. The commentators already on the site, cruising the choppy waters of the Pacific in a rented motorboats, reported that there were no signs of any oil or wreckage. Sadly, however, there was little doubt that the aircraft had crashed somewhere. The flight crew of another airliner had seen a huge jet explode in midair, probably the victim of sabotage. Eerily, the one piece of hard information constantly played and replayed over the radio was the last transmission from the pilot of the huge aeroplane reporting a fire in his cargo hold. So the aircraft had come down, but where exactly? So the aircraft had come down, but where exactly? For all the lack of information, the traffic continued to press southwards. Behind me, an impatient American newsreel team decided to overtake the line of crawling vehicles on the pedestrian verge, and the first altercation soon broke out. Police stood at the major crossroads with their usual flair managed to slow down any progress. After an hour of this, my car's engine began to boil, and I was forced to turn the lane vehicle into a roadside garage. Sitting irritably in the forecourt and well aware that I was unlikely to reach the crash site until the late afternoon, I looked away from the almost stationary traffic to the mountains a few miles inland. The foothills of the coastal range, they rose sharply into a hard and cloudless sky, their steep peaks lit by the sun. It occurred to me that no one had actually witnessed the descent of the stricken airliner into the sea. Somewhere above the mountains, the explosion had taken place, and the likely trajectory would have carried the unhappy machine into the Pacific. On the other hand, an observational error of a few miles, a miscalculation of a few seconds by the flight crew who had seen the explosion would make possible an impact point well inland. By coincidence, two journalists in a nearby car were discussing exactly the possibility of a garage attendant filling their fuel tank. This young man was gesturing towards the mountains, where a rough road wound up a steep valley. He slapped his hands together as if mimicking an explosion. A journalist watched him skeptically, unimpressed by the story and put off by the young man's rough appearance and almost unintelligible local dialect. Paying him off, they turned their car onto the road and rejoined the slowly moving caravan to the south. The attendant watched them go, his mind on other things. When he had filled my radiator, I asked him, "You saw an explosion in the mountains?" "I might have done. It's hard to say. It could have been lightning or a snowslide." "You didn't see any..." Sorry, I thought my voice was spoken. "You didn't see the aircraft?" "No, I can't say that." "No, I can't say that." He shrugged, only interested in going off duty. I waited while he handed over to his relief, climbed onto the back of a friend's motorcycle and set off along the coast with everyone else. I looked up at the road into the valley. By luck, the farm track behind the garage joined at 400 yards inland on the far side of the field. 10 minutes later, I was driving up the valley and away from the coastal plain. What made me follow this hunch that the aircraft had come down in the mountains? No, that's a question. It sounded like a statement. We'll go again. How many pages is this? That's too bad. It's shorter than the last one. Okay. Where am I? Oh yeah. 10 minutes later, I was driving up the valley and away from the coastal plain. What made me follow this hunch that the aircraft had come down in the mountains? Self-interest? Clearly. The hope of scooping all that. Okay. What made me follow this hunch that the aircraft had come down in the mountains? Self-interest? Clearly, the hope of scooping all my colleagues and at least last impressing my editor. Ahead of me was a small village, a rundown collection of houses grouped around two sides of the sloping square. Half a dozen farmers sat outside the tavern, little more than a window in a stone wall. Already the coast road is far below, bottom of the world. From this height, someone would certainly have noticed the explosion if the aircraft had fallen here. I would question a few people. If they had seen nothing, I would turn around and head south with everyone else. As I entered the village, I remembered how poverty-stricken this area of Mexico had always been, almost unchanged since the early 19th century. Most of the modest stone houses were still without electricity. There was a single television aerial and a few elderly cars, brakes on wheels, sat on the roadside among pieces of rusted agricultural equipment. The worn hill slope stretched up the valley, and the dull soil had long since given up its meagre fertility. However, the chance remained that these villagers had seen something, a flash perhaps, or even the sight of the stricken airliner plummeting overhead towards the sea. I stopped my car in a cobbled square and walked across to the farmers outside the tavern. "I'm looking for the crushed aircraft," I told them. "It may have come down..." Sorry, that was a bit silly. What was his voice anyway? "I'm looking for the crushed aircraft," I told them. "It may have come down here. Have any of you seen anything?" They were staring at my car, clearly a far more glamorous machine than anything that might fall from the sky. They shook their heads, waving their hands in a peculiarly secretive way. I knew I'd wasted my time in setting out on this private expedition. The mountains rose around me on all sides, the valleys dividing like the entrances to an immense maze. As I turned to go back to my car, one of the older farmers touched my arm. He pointed casually to a narrow valley sheltering between two adjacent peaks high above us. "The aircraft," I repeated. "It's up there." "What, are you sure?" I tried to control my excitement, the fear of giving away anything. I got that wrong way around. Okay, I'll say again. Not from the beginning. The aircraft, I repeated, it's up there. What? Are you sure? I tried to control my excitement for fear of giving anything away. The old man nodded, his interest fading. Yes, at the end of that valley. It's a long way. Within moments I had set off again, restraining myself with difficulty from overtaxing the engine. A few vague words of this old man convinced me that I was on the right track and about to achieve the scoop I'd yearned for throughout my professional career. However casually he had spoken, he had meant what he said. I pressed on up a narrow road, forcing the car in and out of the potholes and rain gullies. At each turn of the road I half expect to see the tailplane of the aircraft poised on a distant crag, and the hundreds of bodies scattered down on the mountain slopes like a fallen army. I started to run over in my mind the opening paragraphs of my dispatch, telephoned to my startled editor, while my rivals were 50 miles away staring into the empty seas. It was vital to achieve the right marriage of sensation and compassion, that irresistible combustion of ruthless realism and melancholy invocation. I would describe the first ominous discovery of a single aircraft seat on a hillside, a poignant trail of ruptured suitcases, a child's fluffy toy, and then a valley floor covered with corpses. For an hour I pressed upon the road, now and then having to stop and kick away the boulders that blocked my path. This remote, infertile region was almost deserted. At intervals, an isolated hovel clung to the hillside. A section of telegraph wire followed me overhead for half a mile, before ending abruptly, as if the telephone company years beforehand had realised that there was no one here to make or receive a call. Once again I began to have second thoughts. Had the old villager been playing me along? Surely if he had seen the aircraft come down, he would have been more concerned. The coastal plain and the sea were now miles behind me, visible only for brief moments I thought of the broken road up the valley. Looking back at the sunlit coast through the rear mirror, I carelessly rolled the car over some heavy rubble. After the collision underneath, I could tell from the different notes of the exhaust that I had damaged the exhaust. It's a weird sentence. I could tell from the different notes of the exhaust that I had damaged the exhaust. Cursing myself for having embarked on this lunatic chase, I knew that I was about to strand myself up here in the mountains. Already the early afternoon light was beginning to fade. Fortunately, I had ample fuel in the car, but on this narrow road it was impossible to turn the vehicle around. Forced to go on, I approached a second village, a clutch of hovels built a century earlier around a now desecrated chapel. The only level place in which to turn a car was temporarily blocked by two peasants loading firewood onto the cart. As I waited for them to move away, I realised how much poorer they were even than the people in the village below them. Their clothes were made partly from leather and partly from animal furs, and they carried shotguns over their shoulders. Weapons I could tell from the way they looked at me. Weapons I could tell from the way they looked at me, which they might not hesitate to use if I remained here after dark. They watched me as I carefully reversed the car, their eyes roving across the expensive sports saloon, the camera equipment on the seat beside me, and even my clothes, all of which must have seemed unbelievably exotic. To explain my presence and give myself some kind of official status that would deter them from emptying their shotguns into my back as I drove off, I said, "I've been ordered to look for the aircraft. It came down somewhere near here." I moved the gears, about to move off, when one of the men nodded in reply. He put one hand on my windshield and with the other pointed to a narrow valley lying between two mountain peaks, 1,000 feet above us.
There were no bubbles. Sorry, I'll put some music on intermission. Let's all go to the law. Ah, my hands are. Really needed a bath all day long. Smile again. Can't find any of my own. It's all the way over here. Could increase efficiency. Much better if I put it somewhere else. Okay. As I drove up the mountain road, all my doubts had gone. This time, once and for all, I proved my worth to a sceptical editor. 2 separate witnesses had confirmed the presence of a crashed aircraft. Careful not to damage a car on this primitive track, I pressed on towards the valley high above me. For the next 2 hours I moved steadily upwards, ever higher into the... Sorry. For the next 2 hours I moved steadily upwards, ever higher into these bleak mountains. By now, all sight of the coastal plain and the sea had gone. Once I caught a brief glimpse of the first village I passed, far below me, like a small stain on the carpet. With luck, the road continued to carry me towards my goal. No more than an earth and stone track. It was barely wide enough to hold the car's wheels as I steered around the endless hairpin bends. Twice more I stopped to question the few mountain people who watched me from the doors of their earth-floored halls. However guardedly, they confirmed that the crashed aircraft lay above. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, I finally reached the remote valley lying between 2 mountain peaks and approached the last of the villages on this long trail. Here the road came to an end, in a stone square surrounded by a cluster of dwellings. They looked as if they had been built 200 years earlier and had spent the intervening time trying to sink back into the mountain. Most of the village is unpopulated, but to my surprise a few people came out of their houses to look at me, gazing with awe at the dusty car. Immediately I was struck by the extremity of their poverty. These people had nothing. They were destitute not merely of worldly goods, but of religious hope and any knowledge of the rest of mankind. As I stepped from my car and lit a cigarette, waiting as they gathered around me at a respectful distance, it struck me as cruelly ironic that the huge airliner, accumulation of almost a century of aviation technology, should have come to its end here amongst these primitive mountain dwellers.
Looking at their unintelligent and passive faces, I felt I was surrounded by a rare group of subnormals, a village of mental defectives, amiable enough to be left on their own, high in this remote valley. Perhaps there was some mineral in the soil that damaged their nervous system and kept them at this simple animal level. I should have read this before. The aircraft. Have you seen the airliner? I called out. Some 10 of the men and women were standing around me, mesmerised by the car, by my cigarette lighter and gold-rimmed glasses, even by my plump flesh. Aircraft? Here, simplifying my speech, I pointed to the rocky slopes and ravines above the village, but none of them seemed to understand me. Perhaps they were mute or deaf. They were guileless enough. It occurred to me that they might be concealing their knowledge of the crash. What riches would they reap from those 1,000 corpses? Enough treasure to transform their lives for a century. I would have expected this small square to be piled high with aircraft seats, suitcases, bodies stacked like firewood. Aircraft, their leader, a small man with a salad face no larger than my fist, repeated the word uncertainly. I realised immediately that none of them would know what I was talking about. Their dialect would be some remote subtone on the borders of intelligent speech. Searching about for a way of reaching them, I noticed my airline bag packed with camera equipment. The identification tag carried a coloured picture of a huge airliner. Tearing off the bag, I showed a picture around the group. Immediately they were nodding away. They muttered to each other, or pointed to a narrow ravine that formed a brief extension of the valley on the other side of the village. A cart track ran towards it, then faded into the stony soil. The airliner, it's up there. Good. Delighted them, I took out my wallet and showed them the large stack of banknotes, my generous expenses for the film festival. Waving the notes encouragingly, I turned to the head man. You lead the way. We'll go there now. Many bodies, eh? Cadavers? Everywhere? They were nodding together, eager eyes staring at the fan of banknotes. We set off in the car through the village, following the cart track along the hillside. Half a mile from the village, we had to stop when the slope became too steep. I'll start that again. Okay. We set off in the car through the village, following the cart track along the hillside. Half a mile from the village, we had to stop when the slope became too steep. The headman pointed to the mouth of the ravine, and we climbed from the car and set off on foot. Still wearing my festival clothes, I found going difficult. The floor of the gorge was covered with sharp stones that cut at my shoes. I fell behind my guide, who was scuttling over the stones like a goat. It surprised me that there were still no signs of a giant airliner, of any debris or of the hundreds of bodies. Looking around me, I expected the mountain to be drenched in corpses. We had reached the end of the gorge. The final 300 feet of the mountain rose into the air towards a peak, separated from its twin by the valley and the village below. The head man had stopped and was pointing to the rocky wall. On his small face was a look of blunted pride. Where? Catching my breath, I took the shroud off my camera lens. There's nothing here. Then I saw where he had guided me, and what the village was all the way down to the coastal plain had described. Lying against the wall of a ravine were the remains of a three-engined military aircraft, its crushed nose and cockpit buried in the rocks. The fabric had long since been stripped away by the wind, and the aircraft was little more than a collection of rusting spars and fuselage members. Obviously, it had been here for more than 30 years, presiding like a tattered deity over this barren mountain. Somehow the fact of its presence had passed down the mountain from one village to the next. The headman pointed to the aircraft skeleton. He smiled at me, but his eyes were fixed on my chest. from a wallet in my breast pocket. Already his hand was slightly outstretched. For all his small size, he looked as dangerous as a wild dog. I took out my wallet and handed him a single banknote, worth more than he could earn in a month. Perhaps because the denomination was meaningless to him, he pointed aggressively at the other notes. I fended him off. Look, I'm not interested in this aircraft. It's the wrong one, you fool. When he stared uncomprehendingly at me, I took the airline tag from my pocket and showed him a picture of a huge passenger jet. This one, very large, hundreds of bodies. Losing my temper and giving way completely to my outrage and disappointment, I screamed at him, "It's the wrong one. Can't you understand? There should be bodies everywhere, hundreds of cadavers." He left me where I was, ranting away at the stony walls of this deserted ravine high in the mountain, and at the skeleton of this wind-blown reconnaissance plane. 10 minutes later, when I returned to my car, I discovered that the slow puncture I expected to leave that afternoon had flattened one of my front tyres. Exhausted now, my shoes pierced by the rocks, my clothes filthy, I slumped behind the steering wheel, realising the futility of this absurd expedition. I'd be lucky to make it back to the coast by nightfall. By then, every other journalist would have reported the sighting of the crashed airline in the Pacific. My editor would be waiting with burning patience for me to follow my story in time for the evening newscasts. Instead, I was high in these barren mountains with a damaged car, my life possibly threatened by these idiot peasants. After resting, I pulled myself together. It took me half an hour to change the wheel. As I started the engine and began the long drive back to the coastal plain, the lights had begun to fade, even here at the peak. The village was 300 yards below me, and I could see the first of the hovels on a bend in the track. One of the villagers was standing beside a low wall, with what seemed to be a weapon in one hand. Immediately I slowed down, knowing that if they decided to attack me, I had little hope of escape. I remembered the wallet in my pocket and took it out. Getting tired. That's still hot. Okay. I remembered the wallet in my pocket and took it out, spreading the banknotes on the seat. Perhaps I could buy my way through them. As I approached, the man stepped forward into the road. The weapon in his hand was a crude spade. The small man, like all the others, his posture was in no way friendly. Rather, he seemed to be asking me for something, almost begging. There was a bundle of old clothing on the verge beside the wall. "Do you want me to buy?" As I slowed down, about to hand one of the banknotes to him, I realised that it was an old woman, like a monkey wrapped in a shawl, staring sightlessly at me. And I saw that her skull-like face was indeed a skull, and that the earth-stained rags were her shroud. I was talking about the bundle. When I said it, I was talking about the bundle. Cadaver, the man spoke nervously, fingering his spade in the dim light. I handed him the money and drove on, joining the road leading to the village. Another younger man stood by the verge 50 yards ahead, also with a spade. The body of a small child, freshly disinterred, sat against the lid of its open coffin. Cadaver. All the way through the village, people stood in the doorways, some alone, those who had no one to disinter for me. I really messed that up. Okay. Another younger man stood by the verge 50 yards ahead, also with a spade. The body of a small child, freshly disinterred, sat against the lid of its open coffin. Cadaver. All the way through the village, people stood in the doorways, some alone, those who had no one to disinter for me, Others with their spades, freshly jerked from their graves, the corpses sat in the dim light in front of the hovels, propped against the stone walls like neglected relations put out last to earn their keep. As I drove past, handing out the last of the money, I could hear the villagers murmuring, their voices following me down the mountainside. As I drove past, handing out the last of my money, I could hear the villagers murmuring, their voices following me down the mountainside. 1975.
It's a really good story.
It's so just a minute ago. Enormous space. Since 19. Page set. Okay.
I really want to read J.G. Ballinger, but I can stick to my guns. Uncle Wiggily is such a good story. You love it. It's so much easier to read. Yeah. I was thinking about the language, it's so easy to, fly through. I like one that I just read, but it is a very good short story, but I found it quite difficult to read. Okay, so another teaser from this book, from Vine Stories by J.G. Ballinger. Okay, it was almost 3 o'clock when Mary Jane finally found Eloise's house. She explained to Eloise, who had come out to the driveway to meet her, that everything had been absolutely perfect, but she had remembered the way exactly until she turned off the Merritt Parkway. Eloise said, "Merritt Parkway, baby," and reminded Mary Jane that she had found the house twice before. But Mary Jane just welled something ambiguous, something about a box of Kleenex, and rushed back to her convertible. How do you not want me to read that? That's Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut. This book's just full of excellent short stories. And I can't believe we don't finish reading. So we've got Perfect Day for Banana Fish, which we've already covered. Next one is Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut. And then there's a great short story called just before the war with the Eskimos. It's perfect. Then The Laughing Man, also exceptional. A short story called Down in the Dinghy, which is beautiful. I just finished, no I didn't, Resume with Love and Squalor, that's exceptional as well. And Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes. So they're the ones I've read so far. I haven't read Dormia Smith's Blue Period or Teddy. I'm assuming they're going to be absolutely perfect anyway. But you see, I can read these. You really need to send me some money via Patreon, because I'm going to sell my books. That'd be ironic, wouldn't it, if I set fire to the bathroom? Yeah, a bit silly, isn't it? So barely touched my eye, and that's quite a short story. I'll read you another one. This is also by J.D. Sallard. I'm going to roll some over because this one's twice as long, 6 pages. So definitely going to need like a lid with a cigarette. Sure. That's giving me this thing now. That's good. I think this way, finger stick. Fingers. Gives a peck on the cheek. So I'll get right on it. No, this video it's a bit too long. You can watch the rest of the region when I'm done in here. The water's still warm, which is good. It's warm now. It was too hot before. Don't let me forget about that. I still need to have a bath as well. I'll tell you what, I'll have a bath